When I first walked the boundaries of my parents' 3-acre plot, the land still whispered their presence. The metal stakes my father had hammered into the ground decades ago stood rusting in the soil, their tops barely visible above the grass line, but to me they were iron signatures, proof of ownership stitched into the earth long before Willowbrook's cookie-cutter houses appeared. The yellow deed from 1978 crackled in my hands like parchment. The ink faded, but the message indelible. Ours. Mineral rights, water rights, every square foot inherited free of entanglements and, most importantly, free of HOA restrictions. That didn't stop Susan Peterson. I heard her before I saw her. Voices carried down the tree line, accompanied by the metallic clank of survey poles and the low hum of equipment being set. When Susan emerged flanked by a county official and a surveying crew, she marched like a general inspecting a battlefield. Her tailored jacket and plastic smile carried all the smugness of a woman intoxicated by her HOA title. She spoke as though the land beneath her shoes was already hers, and she was simply bestowing it upon the community. "Mr. Grant, perfect timing," she said brightly, gesturing to the field behind me. "We've decided this underutilized space is ideal for a community wellness center. The neighborhood needs a gathering hub, don't you think?" Her words weren't a request. They were a performance, one she assumed the survey crew and county official would applaud. The official stared at his clipboard, clearly realizing something was off, while the surveyor's hands hesitated over his tripod, caught between his contract and his conscience. I kept my voice level, almost conversational. "That's an interesting project, Susan. Do you have the building permits to conduct development on private property?" For the first time, a ripple of unease passed over her face. "HOA projects don't need individual permits," she scoffed. "We handle all community development internally through board authority." That was a lie, and a dangerous one. Before I could answer, a familiar voice called from the neighboring yard. "That is completely false," Frank Miller barked, striding toward us with the confidence of 30 years in the county building department. His short, stocky frame carried the weight of experience, and he spoke like a man who had drafted the laws she was trying to bend. "Every construction project requires permits, particularly one on privately owned land." "Ma'am, do you even have authorization from the property owner?" Susan faltered. Her smile stiffened around the edges, that brittle grin of someone unaccustomed to being corrected in public. "I'm the HOA president, and this falls under our community development guidelines." The surveyor froze. The county official winced. They both knew community guidelines evaporated the moment property sat outside the association's reach. Frank narrowed his eyes, studying her like a document stamped with inconsistencies. Before she could regain momentum, Mrs. Chen drifted over from down the street, her dachshund tugging at the leash. She leaned toward me with a whisper. "She pulled this last year with the Johnsons. Said their backyard was community space. They fought back, but only after thousands in legal fees. Be careful. She tests boundaries, hoping no one pushes back." I held up the folded deed, letting the late sun glint across its faded font. "This property predates your HOA by almost 20 years, I said plainly for the gathered crew. "You have about as much authority here as the mayor of Dallas has over a farm in Oklahoma." There was a pause, a delicious silence where the surveyor began quietly packing his gear. The county official suddenly fascinated with his clipboard, and Mrs. Chen nodded with a barely whispered, "I knew it." Susan blinked rapidly, her brain firing through excuses. Then her tone hardened. "Well, we'll see about that. I will be consulting our HOA attorney regarding abandoned property statutes and community safety issues." With that, she turned sharply, heels snapping against the dirt, and strode back toward the subdivision. Her crew hesitated, then followed like soldiers retreating from a lost skirmish. I watched her go and felt an almost clinical calm. 5 years earlier, when another dispute had cost me my last house, emotion had been my undoing. Panic, anger, desperate phone calls to lawyers I couldn't afford. But not this time. Now I had knowledge, strategy, and patience. Susan's angry retreat didn't frighten me. It reassured me, because here's the truth. Confidence with no authority isn't harmless. It's reckless, and reckless people always make mistakes. As I slipped my phone from my pocket and reviewed the video I'd been recording since she stepped onto my soil, I realized I hadn't just witnessed a failed power play. I'd just captured the opening move of a war she didn't even know she was starting, and this time I was more than ready. The morning after Susan's retreat, I had expected some quiet. Instead, my phone lit up with a dozen missed calls from county departments I hadn't heard from in years. Insurance, mortgage, even the tax office. They all wanted urgent clarification about reports of new construction on my estate. Reports I never filed. Reports that could only have been planted. While Laura poured her coffee, her expression sharpened with every new voicemail. And I knew Peterson wasn't just shifting tactics. She was escalating. By noon, inspectors began showing up at my door. One claimed I had unregistered propane tanks. Another insisted my septic system needed emergency review. A third suggested I was operating an unlicensed rental business out of the old ranch house. Each one walked the land, looked around uncomfortably, found no violations, and left shaking their heads. "Someone's filing false reports," one admitted quietly. "We'll note this as harassment." But by the fifth clipboard in my driveway that week, the pattern was undeniable. Peterson was trying to choke me with paperwork, exploiting every bureaucratic channel until I cracked. This wasn't guesswork. I caught her in the act. A contractor in a mud-spattered pickup showed up at the driveway one afternoon, waving a blueprint at me like it was a confession. "Sir, are you the property owner?" he asked nervously. When I nodded, he swallowed hard. "Mrs. Peterson hired my crew for a community wellness center. But these plans?" He spread them over his hood and my stomach dropped. It wasn't a wellness center. It was the architectural fantasy of a private estate. Vaulted ceilings, marble entryway, oversized walk-in closets. It was a luxury villa disguised in HOA brochures as community development. He shook his head. "I've built actual community centers. None of them had wine cellars." His voice cracked with real fear now, the awareness of liability sinking in. "She even gave me permits, but the formatting's off. If these are forgeries and I build out here, my license, my company, my family's livelihood, it's all on the line." He rolled the blueprints up angrily, saying he'd call his lawyer and insurance that same night. Jesus Christ, she told me the HOA owned this land outright. It was confirmation of what Frank and Mrs. Chen had warned me. Peterson wasn't just entitled. She was deceptive. She had built her little kingdom on smokescreens and bullying, and when that failed, she invented paperwork to force her way in. The crowning moment came a week later when she arrived at my door, husband in tow, holding a manila folder like it was a trump card in a courtroom drama. Her smile was tight with confidence. "Mr. Grant," she began as neighbors watched from their porches, "we've discovered significant financial irregularities, requiring HOA intervention for community protection." She thrust the folder into my hands. The documents inside were a laughable mixture of forged tax records and delinquency notices. According to Peterson, I owed $12,000 in community maintenance assessments dating back years. The county formatting was all wrong. The assessment numbers didn't align with official systems. Her attempt at forgery was obvious. The digital equivalent of a child's handwriting scrawled into a checkbook. She had spent hours fabricating a lie, and she handed it to me like proof of her dominion. "Your parents left this place neglected for far too long," she said to the gathered neighbors. "We're just doing what's best for Willowbrook." Frank came striding across the lot, his building department training already scanning the forms like blueprints. Within seconds, his face hardened. "Susan, these are forgeries. The numbering system is wrong. HOA liens can't exceed the cost of services actually provided, and this exceeds that by 5 times. His tone was sharp, final. Even her husband looked pale as he tugged at her arm, but Susan pressed on, voice rising with theatrics. "Community safety is my fiduciary duty." Laura stepped outside then, holding the actual deed in one hand and pulling her phone in the other. Calm, cold precision lined her voice. "These documents are fraudulent. You've now crossed into financial crime. And since you've given us the physical copies, you've handed us evidence." She flipped the folder shut, tucked it firmly under her arm, and with that simple gesture doomed Susan's entire campaign. I realized then that Susan's arrogance was her greatest weakness. She believed her title gave her the authority to rewrite reality. Instead, it was handing us the ammunition we needed. Every false notice, every phone call, every forged number, it was all becoming part of a trail that would one day be read aloud in a courtroom. But the true weight of her scheme lay heavier than just paperwork. That same night, I sat at the kitchen table surrounded by scattered reports, inspector's notes, phone logs, and Laura's careful annotations. and the pressure hit me all at once. 5 years earlier, I'd lost another home in a tangle of disputes I hadn't been prepared for. I remembered the helplessness of answering every call like a defendant before trial, the dread of waiting for the next blow to come. My chest tightened with the memory, palms sweating against old trauma. Laura noticed and set her hand on mine. "You're not that man anymore," she said quietly. "This time we're documenting. This time we're beating her at her own game." Her faith settled me even as fear gnawed at my edges. Because she was right, this time I wasn't reacting with anger. I was recording, filing, preparing. Peterson wanted chaos. But what she didn't realize yet was that every desperate swing she took was carving her own noose. As I slid the forged documents into a labeled evidence binder and set my camera on the charger, the thought crystallized in my head like steel. Let her keep lying. Let her keep faking. With every false claim, she isn't burying me. She's burying herself. I woke that morning to the sound of engines that don't belong in quiet farmland. Not pickup trucks, not tractors, heavy machinery, bulldozers. I felt the vibration before I even pulled the curtain back. And there they were, crawling over my parents' land like steel beasts, chewing through soil that had been untouched for decades. I stood in stunned silence for a moment, sick to my stomach, before the anger rose up and replaced it with resolve. There was Susan Peterson, hard hat perched proudly on her hair, standing with clipboard in hand like some suburban general overseeing her conquest. She wasn't hiding what she was doing. She smiled broadly as if nothing illegal was happening, waving glossy brochures at a cluster of neighbors she'd clearly invited to witness the performance. Her voice carried across the land as if it were already hers. "Welcome to the future of Willowbrook. A community wellness center right in your neighborhood." I nearly laughed. Wellness center? The blueprints I'd already seen from her contractor told the truth. This wasn't a wellness center. It was her dream villa dressed up in marketing slogans. Marble kitchens, a wine cellar, a 3-car garage. You don't build those for yoga classes and civic engagement. Neighbors gathered nearby, some whispering concerns, others nodding curiously. Everyone wanted to believe property values would rise, that they were about to become shareholders in a piece of progress. And Susan played the role perfectly. She shook hands, handed out flyers, painted pictures of saunas, gardens, and therapy rooms. She sold them a fantasy, built on theft. Frank arrived seconds after I called, his work boots crunching gravel, camera slung around his neck. He stood by me at the edge of the property, shaking his head slowly. "Every minute those bulldozers operate without a permit is a lawsuit waiting to happen," he muttered. His voice was calm, clinical. He'd seen this sort of nonsense before, but never this blatant. And then, like clockwork, Susan revealed her trump card. Into the crowd strode Councilman Rick Torres, wearing his politician's smile, the kind rehearsed in mirrors. Behind his handshake and striped tie was the smell of campaign season. He was up for re-election in 6 months. He didn't come here out of concern. He came here for votes. Susan clasped his hand and proudly gestured to the excavation behind her. "This is how Willowbrook leads the future, Councilman. Responsible development, community wellness, economic growth." Torres stepped forward, raising his voice above the machinery. "This wellness center represents the kind of forward-thinking community development we should all support." His words dripped with approval, but they carried a hollow ring. The kind of tone you use when you've already promised your endorsement in exchange for something. I knew instantly. Susan had bought him with HOA endorsements, promising his campaign the backing of 3 subdivisions if he gave her legitimacy. And just like that, you could feel the crowd lean toward her side. Neighbors who moments ago frowned at bulldozers began nodding as if the councilman's suit added law to her lies. It infuriated me, but also clarified the stakes. She wasn't just waging war on me anymore. She was drafting the entire neighborhood into her scheme. So I stepped forward loud enough to cut over the bulldozers. "Councilman Torres, maybe you can answer the simple question no one else here seems to. Who owns this land?" I held up my deed, yellowed with age but unshakable in its clarity. Because according to every county record, it's mine. Bought in 1978, long before the Willowbrook HOA even existed. That silenced the cheerleaders. The neighbors turned their eyes toward Torres, eyebrows raised. For the first time, his polished speech stumbled. He smiled tightly and gave the kind of vague answer politicians master. "Well, these projects involve multiple stakeholders and complex legal frameworks. In other words, I know she's lying. But she promised me votes. Frank stepped in, his authority crisp and steady. I worked 30 years in the building department. There are no permits here, no applications, no approvals. This is trespass and illegal construction. His words landed differently. The crowd wavered, torn between the hope Peterson was dangling and the law Frank and I held up in plain daylight. Susan didn't miss a beat. She slipped into her patronizing voice and wagged her clipboard toward Frank. There it is, the obstructionist attitude that drags down our community. This project is about progress, and some people just can't stand improvement. Some neighbors applauded. Others shook their heads. A line had been drawn not in property stakes, but in opinion. Property rights versus shiny promises. By dusk, the bulldozers had carved out a foundation large enough to erase my parents' garden. The air stank of diesel and displaced soil. Neighbors had drifted home divided. Torres had retreated to his car, leaving behind his endorsement without backing it on record. Peterson, though, was radiant, hovering among her workers as though every scoop of dirt was burying my rights deeper. Laura stood beside me as the floodlights flicked on and workers prepared to dig through the night. Her voice was quiet but firm. She's committed now. Every day she builds without permission, we collect evidence. The more she builds, the more she hands us nail after nail to seal her own coffin. Frank's words echoed the same. She's gambling that speed buries the law. But what she's really doing is building Exhibit A. I looked across the bulldozed lot, the soil where my parents once planted tomatoes, where I'd learned to rake leaves with my father as a boy. Now bare, scarred, desecrated. For a moment, grief bit deep. But then another feeling rose, steady and sharper than anger. Clarity. She thought pouring concrete on my ground would erase my rights. She thought bulldozers were louder than deeds. But every hour she trespassed, the case against her grew sharper. This wasn't the end. It was just her biggest mistake yet, and I was documenting every engine, every lie, every hand she shook. She wasn't building a wellness center. She was building her own downfall. By the third day of construction, I realized fighting Peterson wasn't about blocking bulldozers anymore. It was about following the money. Frank and I sat hunched in his garage, HOA bylaws spread across his workbench, pages highlighted and marked with sticky notes. He tapped the document with his pencil. Here it is. Every expenditure above $500 requires board approval and advance notice to all members. No exceptions, he muttered. If she funded this luxury project with HOA money, she's committed embezzlement. Laura joined us, flipping through receipts she'd managed to request under state nonprofit disclosure laws. Within minutes, she found what Frank suspected: invoices for architectural plans, excavation deposits, equipment rentals. Nearly $47,000 spent with no signatures other than Susan's. Laura slid the papers toward me, her lawyer's eye cold and precise. This is not just reckless, she said. It's systematic embezzlement. She raided member dues to build a mansion on your land. For years, Peterson had bullied individuals with fake citations and forged notices. But now, with numbers on paper, her misconduct transformed into crimes with names. Misuse of nonprofit funds, financial fraud, breach of fiduciary duty. We didn't keep it quiet. I started walking door to door, binder in hand. Mrs. Chen was the first neighbor I showed. I'll never forget how her face darkened as she read the records, her lips thinning into a line. We pay $600 a year in dues for street lamps and lawn upkeep, she said, voice shaking. Not a penny for Susan's dream house. You need to show everyone this, Grant. Her outrage was contagious. Within hours, word of deception swept across Willowbrook. Neighbors who once clapped politely at Peterson's speeches now clustered in driveways and whispered in angry tones. A few even admitted they thought something was off when their annual fees quietly increased, yet repairs went unfinished. Now they had the explanation spelled out in Peterson's own invoices. That night, when Peterson threw on her hard hat and strutted around the excavation site, she still clutched her glossy brochures, still repeated her community wellness center pitch. But something in the way residents watched her had shifted. Nobody asked about yoga classes or saunas. They asked, "Where's our $47,000? The following morning brought something Peterson couldn't gloss over. Channel 7's investigative reporter, Sarah Martinez. She'd been covering HOA corruption across Texas. And when I handed her the evidence package, financial reports, forged permits, contractor testimony, her eyes lit up like a detective connecting a case. HOA abuse touches thousands across the state, she explained, her camera crew already rolling. But a wellness center secretly funded by embezzled member dues, built on land the association doesn't own. That's a scandal people will remember. The stop work order hit at noon. County inspectors marched up with clipboards and cameras, documenting permit violations across Peterson's so-called project. They announced flat and loud that all construction must cease immediately pending resolution. Peterson's supporters gasped. Even her hired laborers folded their arms and stepped back at the warning. But Susan? She laughed breezily and told the assembly that community development lies outside normal building regulations. Even her most loyal allies flinched. Neighbors exchanged troubled looks, murmurs cutting through the crowd. Some stepped away from her completely. As if the humiliation weren't enough, the district attorney's representative slipped into the back row of the community meeting that evening, notepad in hand. He didn't need to make speeches. His presence alone changed the tone. When Mrs. Chen stood and testified that Peterson had pressured her to sign false reports claiming Laura was unstable, the DA wrote it down methodically. When another neighbor admitted to donating extra cash for the Wellness Center slush fund, he wrote that too. As testimony piled up, so did silence. Peterson attempted to regain her fire, waving the HOA charter as if it were scripture. But her voice faltered. Fraud doesn't sound so inspiring when spoken under fluorescent lights with prosecutors listening. By the time Frank stood up, blueprints under his arm, the board was cracked wide open. 30 years in the building department gave his voice more weight than Peterson's title ever carried. This structure is unsafe. There are no permits. There is no compliance. It is condemned before it's finished, he said flatly. Every day she spends HOA money on this hole, she buries your money with it. Gasps filled the community center. A few board members openly began discussing resignation to avoid liability. The people who had nodded, along to Susan's arrogance days earlier, were now backing away, literally moving their folding chairs an inch farther from her table, and that's when the inspector walked in with the official stop work papers still damp with signatures. He posted them on the bulletin board for maximum effect. Construction is hereby halted effective immediately, pending investigation into ownership and permit violations, he declared. Susan tried for one last flourish, declaring in a shrill voice that no city inspector had authority over her community wellness vision. But when even her supporters gasped at the insanity of her words, you could feel it, the ground shifting beneath her self-built throne. Neighbors weren't whispering support anymore. They were whispering fraud. As Sarah Martinez's cameras captured every second, I realized Susan had made her fatal error. She thought rapid construction could bury my rights. She thought speed and shiny brochures would outpace the law. But all she was building was a public, item-by-item indictment of her own corruption. And I was going to make sure the entire city watched her empire crumble. The day of Peterson's so-called grand opening dawned like a parody of her ambitions. She'd sent out hand-delivered invitations printed on heavy cardstock, promising a new era for Willowbrook, and telling residents to dress business casual as if stepping into her fantasy mansion gave it legitimacy. When Laura and I arrived with Frank at our side, the villa already buzzed with 36 guests. Realtors, HOA members, even a few curious neighbors wandered through the marble-floored foyer admiring granite countertops and vaulted ceilings, all on my land. Peterson floated like a hostess at a country club gala, silk dress trimmed, glass of white wine in hand, selling the lie for the last time. She ushered Councilman Torres to the gourmet kitchen, pointing at Italian fixtures as if she'd bought them with her own money, rather than embezzled HOA dues. To the untrained eye, it looked like victory. But to the trained eye, it was the setup for a downfall. I waited until the largest crowd had gathered in the foyer before stepping forward. My voice cut through her speech like a gavel. Thank you, Mrs. Peterson, for building such a beautiful house. On my land, the room stilled. I held up the deed from 1978, flanked by county records and survey plats. Gasps rippled like dropped glass. Laura laid out documents proving the $47,000 of unauthorized HOA spending. Frank detailed structural violations, and then the sheriff and district attorney's representatives, who had been waiting in plain clothes, stepped forward with arrest warrants. The cameras from Channel 7, already rolling, swung wide. Suddenly, Peterson's grand opening wasn't a showcase but a sting operation. Deputies cuffed her in the marble foyer under the glow of chandeliers she thought she'd enjoy. Her silk dress bunched awkwardly as they read her Miranda rights. Guests who had come to sip wine now backed silently toward the exits, muttering apologies, shaking their heads, realizing they'd been duped into supporting fraud. Meanwhile, the DA's voice rang firm. "Susan Peterson, you're under arrest for embezzlement, fraud, trespassing, and conspiracy." And then, with the arrival of federal bank investigators, the hammer struck harder. Forged documents used for national loans turned her crimes into felonies with 30-year sentences attached. Peterson screamed about the community's will, even as she was loaded into the patrol car. But the spell had broken. Neighbors who'd once cowered before her smile now whispered words like embezzler and thief. Torres, red-faced, slipped out the back door, his campaign derailed by association. Inspectors condemned the villa on the spot. No permits, no code compliance, every inch uninhabitable without $150,000 in remediation. And still, ironically, possession was mine. My parents' old land now crowned with a luxury villa constructed illegally with somebody else's money and destined to become my family's home. Months later, after Peterson pled guilty, she sat behind bars owing $200,000 in restitution and permanently banned from HOA leadership. Torres lost re-election to a candidate running on property rights reform. Frank was voted HOA President by acclamation, introducing transparency rules sarcastically, nicknamed the Peterson Clause. Even the state banking commission rewrote regulations about HOA fraud after national headlines, featured footage of Peterson's handcuffs glinting under TV lights. What she'd intended as her legacy had become a textbook on how arrogance buries itself. But the most poignant moment came quietly, long after the cameras left. Laura and I walked the villa's polished halls, the echo of our footsteps mingling with memories of my parents' modest ranch. In the oversized walk-in closet Peterson had designed for herself, we stored my father's old work jackets and my mother's quilts. In the marble bathroom where Peterson once imagined sipping wine, Laura placed the worn enamel toothbrush cup my mother used her whole life. It felt symbolic, as if integrity had reclaimed space stolen by greed. The neighbors, hardened by shame, began checking in, not to apologize to us, but to admit how easily they'd been sold. Mrs. Chen told me softly, "I almost signed her papers. I almost destroyed your family's life with one signature." That honesty mattered more than any restitution check. The land was healed physically. The community was healing morally. Now when I sit on the deck, deed still framed in my study, I think about what Peterson tried to steal and what she accidentally built in the process. She thought speed would bury the law, but every bulldozer pour only cemented evidence against her. She thought political allies could shield her, but their silence condemned her faster than our cameras. She thought fear would keep us quiet, but patience turned her own lies into nooses. I look out across this villa-perched estate, legally mine again, and I feel no hollow pride. Only quiet. Because the true lesson here isn't about fences or lawsuits. It's that arrogance always writes its own downfall when it collides with persistence. Susan Peterson wanted a monument to her ego. What she left instead was a warning carved into case law, an example in property rights lectures across Texas, and a house that now safeguards my parents' legacy. And maybe the simplest truth of all, patience and documentation beat arrogance every single time.